My name is Kai Sterling, and at 28, I never imagined I'd be standing outside a beachfront villa in Key West, Florida, watching my supposedly dead uncle flip fish on a grill while laughing with a woman half his age. The man who'd been cremated 2 years ago was very much alive, sporting a deep tan and what looked like a brand new Rolex. The smell of grilled mahi-mahi mixed with jasmine from the garden carried on the ocean breeze as I stood frozen behind a cluster of palm trees, my hands trembling as I held up my phone to record what I was seeing. If you're wondering how a dead man taught me the most expensive lesson about family loyalty and why I'm smiling despite having my entire world turned upside down, stick around. Before I continue, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button and subscribe to see how I turn this devastating betrayal into the sweetest revenge against my own family. Let me take you back to where this all began, because the story of how I ended up married to a woman I barely knew starts in a cramped suburban house in Portland, Oregon. I grew up in a modest 3-bedroom ranch house on Maple Street, where my parents Victor and Elena Sterling ran a small real estate development company that seemed to lurch from one financial crisis to another. Dad was the eternal optimist, always talking about the next big project that would finally put us on easy street. Mom was the practical one, managing the books and trying to keep creditors at bay with carefully timed payments and endless refinancing schemes. Money was a constant source of tension in our house. I remember countless dinner conversations that started about my grades or weekend plans, but somehow always circled back to property taxes, construction loans, or the latest client who'd decided to back out of a deal. My escape was technology. While other kids my age were playing sports or hanging out at the mall, I was teaching myself to code in our basement, surrounded by my dad's old business magazines and my mom's collection of self-help books about financial success. By high school, I was building websites for local businesses, earning enough to buy my own laptop and start saving for college. My parents were proud but distracted, always focused on their next development project that would supposedly change everything for our family. Uncle Mike was different. Michael Hartwell was my dad's older brother, a successful investment banker who'd never married and treated me like the son he never had. Every few months, he'd show up at our house driving whatever luxury car had caught his fancy that year, bringing expensive gifts, and taking me out for dinners at restaurants where the appetizers cost more than our family typically spent on groceries in a week. He paid for my laptop upgrades, covered my college application fees, and always seemed to appear whenever my parents were particularly stressed about money. "Your parents are good people, Kai," he told me during my senior year of high school as we sat in his BMW outside a steakhouse downtown. "But they're dreamers. You've got a practical mind. Use it." He slipped me $500 bills, money I knew my parents would never accept directly from him. "For whatever you need for college. Books, equipment, whatever. Don't tell them where it came from." Uncle Mike's financial support continued through my 4 years at Oregon State, where I studied computer science and graduated with a job offer from a Portland-based tech startup called Innovate Tech Solutions. By 25, I was making $85,000 a year as a senior software engineer, enough to move into a decent one-bedroom apartment downtown and start building the life I'd always imagined for myself. That life included Skylar Chen, a brilliant marketing director I'd met at a tech networking event 3 years earlier. Skylar was everything I'd hoped to find in a partner. Smart, ambitious, with a laugh that could light up any room and a way of making even mundane activities feel like adventures. She worked for a Fortune 500 consulting firm, making more money than I did, and had this incredible ability to see potential in everything around her. We'd been together for 3 years, living in separate apartments but spending most nights together, talking about marriage and the house we'd eventually buy in the hills overlooking the city. I'd already bought the ring, a simple but elegant solitaire that cost me 2 months' salary, hidden in my sock drawer while I planned the perfect proposal. Skylar had no idea, though she'd started dropping hints about her favorite venues for weddings, and had developed a sudden interest in browsing jewelry stores whenever we walked through the mall. Life felt like it was finally falling into place after years of uncertainty and financial stress. Then came the phone call that changed everything. It was a Tuesday evening in March when my phone rang while Skylar and I were cooking dinner together in my apartment. Mom's name appeared on the screen, which wasn't unusual, but her voice when I answered was different. Shaky, urgent, the kind of tone that immediately made my stomach drop. "Kai, you need to come home tonight," she said without any greeting. "It's Uncle Mike. The doctors found something during his routine physical. We're all meeting at his house at 8. I found the entire family gathered in Uncle Mike's living room 2 hours later, the same room where we'd celebrated Christmas mornings and birthday parties throughout my childhood. Uncle Mike sat in his leather recliner, looking smaller somehow, while my parents occupied the couch across from him. The coffee table between them was covered with medical documents and what appeared to be legal paperwork. "Stage 4 pancreatic cancer," Uncle Mike said simply when I walked in, his voice steady but tired. "The doctors are saying 6 months, maybe less. I wanted to tell you all together because there are some things we need to discuss while I'm still thinking clearly." Looking back now, I should have noticed how quickly the conversation turned from Uncle Mike's health to his finances, how prepared my parents seemed for what should have been devastating news. But at the time, I was too shocked by the diagnosis to pay attention to the subtle wrongness of the entire situation. The next 3 weeks became a carefully orchestrated campaign to reshape my entire future, though I wouldn't recognize the manipulation until much later. Uncle Mike's diagnosis dominated every conversation in our family, but what struck me as odd was how quickly the focus shifted from his medical treatment to his estate planning. Within 48 hours of that initial meeting, my parents had scheduled appointments with Uncle Mike's lawyer, his financial advisor, and someone they referred to only as the specialist who handles these situations. During that first week, I met Zara Blackwood for the first time. She appeared at Uncle Mike's house on a Thursday morning, introduced as the private caregiver who would be managing his daily medical needs. Zara was 26, with auburn hair pulled back in a professional ponytail and the kind of calm competence that seemed to radiate from experienced healthcare workers. She had a nursing degree from OHSU and specialized in end-of-life care, my mother explained, as if she'd personally vetted dozens of candidates for the position. "I've been working with terminal patients for 4 years, Zara told me during our first conversation, her voice gentle but matter-of-fact. "My goal is to keep your uncle comfortable and maintain his dignity throughout this process." She carried herself with quiet confidence, speaking knowledgeably about pain management, nutritional needs, and the practical aspects of home hospice care. Nothing about her demeanor suggested anything other than professional dedication to her patients' well-being. What I didn't know then was that my parents were drowning in debt far deeper than I'd ever imagined. The real estate development company that had struggled throughout my childhood was actually $800,000 in the red. Not the $50,000 or $60,000 in temporary cash flow problems they'd always claimed. 3 major projects had fallen through in the past 18 months, leaving them liable for construction loans, environmental assessments, and legal fees that had consumed their savings, their home equity, and their business credit line. "We're looking at bankruptcy, Kai," my father admitted during a private conversation in Uncle Mike's kitchen the following Sunday. "Not just the business, personal bankruptcy. We could lose the house, the cars, everything we've worked for." His hands shook slightly as he poured coffee, a detail that should have triggered more questions from me about the timing of Uncle Mike's estate. According to the document, was worth approximately $2.1 million. His house was valued at $1.3 million. He had 6 in investment, and most importantly, a life insurance worth $800,000 that would pay out immediately. The math was simple and brutal. Uncle Mike's death would solve my parents' financial crisis completely, with enough left over to restart their business on solid footing. The problem is the caregiver situation, my mother explained during what she called a family strategy meeting the second week after Uncle Mike's diagnosis. "Zara is wonderful, absolutely dedicated, but there are certain legal complications that could arise if she's still considered an employee when Mike passes away. Those complications, as outlined by Uncle Mike's lawyer Jasper Reed, centered around inheritance law and the potential for caregiver exploitation claims. If Ms. Blackwood is working in a professional capacity when Mr. Reed explained in his downtown office, there could be challenges to the will, investigations into undue influence, delays in probate that could stretch for months or even years. The solution they proposed was as audacious as it was specific. If Zara became a family member rather than an employee, those legal complications would disappear. A marriage between me and Zara would establish her as Uncle Mike's niece-in-law, eliminating any question of improper caregiver relationships while ensuring the estate could transfer quickly and cleanly to the intended beneficiaries. "It would be temporary, obviously," Uncle Mike said when he first broached the subject, "just until the estate is settled and your parents are back on their feet. Zara understands the situation completely. She's agreed to a financial arrangement that would compensate her fairly for the inconvenience." The financial arrangement, as it turned out, was $150,000 for Zara, paid from the life insurance proceeds. She would marry me, continue caring for Uncle Mike until his death, help facilitate the estate transfer, and then we would quietly divorce after an appropriate mourning period. Everyone would get what they needed. My parents would avoid bankruptcy, Zara would receive substantial compensation for her cooperation, and I would be helping to preserve our family's financial stability during an impossible situation. "What about Skylar?" I asked during the meeting where they formally presented this plan. The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire no one wanted to acknowledge. "Skylar is a lovely girl," my mother said carefully. "But surely she'll understand that family comes first during a crisis like this. You two can get back together after everything is settled. True love can survive a temporary separation." The pressure was relentless and came from every direction. Uncle Mike, looking frailer each day, spoke about his dying wish to see the family financially secure. My parents presented detailed spreadsheets showing exactly how the inheritance would be allocated, how their debts would be paid, and how quickly they could rebuild their business. Zara herself was surprisingly understanding about the arrangement, acknowledging the unusual circumstances and emphasizing her professional approach to the situation. "I know this is strange, Kai," she said during one of our planning conversations, "but I've seen families destroyed by medical bankruptcies and estate complications. If I can help prevent that while doing my job caring for your uncle, it seems like the right thing to do." The timeline added urgency to every decision. Uncle Mike's condition was deteriorating rapidly, they explained, and there were legal requirements about mental competency that meant all estate planning needed to be finalized while he could still sign documents. The marriage needed to happen within 3 weeks, before Uncle Mike's cognitive abilities declined further. Breaking up with Skylar was the hardest conversation of my life. I met her at our favorite restaurant, Cafe Muse, where we'd had our first date 3 years earlier. She knew something was wrong the moment I sat down. My usual smile replaced by what she later described as the expression of someone attending his own funeral. "My family needs me to do something," I began, the words feeling like broken glass in my throat. "Uncle Mike is dying, and there are legal complications with his estate. I have to marry his caregiver to protect the inheritance." Skylar's reaction progressed through disbelief, anger, and finally a cold fury I'd never seen from her before. "You're choosing money over us?" she asked, her voice deadly quiet. "You're throwing away 3 years for an inheritance?" "It's temporary," I insisted, knowing how hollow the words sounded. "Just until Uncle Mike passes and the estate is settled. Then we can get back together. If you walk away from me for this," Skylar said, standing up from the table, "don't expect me to be waiting when you decide you're ready to come back." She left her engagement ring on the table between us, a small circle of diamond and platinum that represented everything I was about to lose. 3 days later, I married Zara Blackwood in a brief civil ceremony at the Multnomah County Courthouse, with my parents and Uncle Mike as the only witnesses. Zara wore a simple blue dress. I wore the same suit I'd purchased for job interviews, and the whole thing took less than 20 minutes. Uncle Mike insisted on taking photos, saying he wanted to remember seeing me married before he passed away. As we signed the marriage certificate, I caught a strange look that passed between Zara and my mother, something too quick to interpret, but somehow significant. At the time, I dismissed it as shared relief that we'd successfully navigated the legal requirements. Looking back now, I understand it was something much more calculating. Moving into Uncle Mike's mansion felt like stepping into a life that belonged to someone else. The 4,200 square foot Tudor-style house on Skyline Boulevard had been Uncle Mike's pride for 15 years, complete with a 3-car garage, wine cellar, and a master suite larger than my entire downtown apartment. Zara and I established an awkward routine almost immediately. She took the guest bedroom on the main floor to be closer to Uncle Mike, while I occupied the master suite upstairs, an arrangement that felt both practical and surreal. Our daily schedules rarely overlapped. I left for Innovate Tech Solutions each morning at 7:30, returning home around 6 to find Zara efficiently managing Uncle Mike's care with the dedication of someone genuinely committed to her patient's comfort. She prepared his meals according to strict dietary guidelines, administered medications on precise schedules, and maintained detailed logs of his symptoms and responses that she reviewed with his oncologist during weekly video calls. "How's he doing today?" became my standard greeting when I arrived home each evening. Zara would provide clinical updates delivered in her calm, professional tone. His appetite was declining. The new pain medication was helping him sleep better. He'd had a good morning but tired easily in the afternoon. She spoke about Uncle Mike's condition, the way a weather reporter might describe atmospheric pressure, factual and detached. What surprised me was how naturally we fell into a domestic rhythm despite the bizarre circumstances of our marriage. Zara was an excellent cook, preparing meals that somehow managed to be both nutritious and comforting. She kept the house immaculately organized, handled Uncle Mike's medical appointments with military precision, and never complained about the demanding nature of round-the-clock caregiving. In the evenings, we'd often find ourselves in the kitchen together, sharing coffee and discussing our days with the careful politeness of roommates who respected each other's space. "You don't have to do this, you know," I told her one evening about 3 weeks into our arrangement, watching her prepare Uncle Mike's evening medication. "The cooking for me, I mean. I'm perfectly capable of feeding myself." Zara smiled, the first genuinely warm expression I'd seen from her. "I know you are, but I like cooking, and it's easier to prepare meals for 3 than to cook separately. Besides, you're helping me as much as I'm helping your family." Uncle Mike's decline during those first months seemed to follow the textbook progression his oncologist had described. He spent most mornings in his study, managing what he called his final business affairs. though he was increasingly secretive about the specific nature of these activities. By noon, fatigue would force him to rest, and afternoons were spent in the living room watching classic movies or reading investment journals with decreasing focus. "The boy treating you well?" Uncle Mike asked Zara during one of his more lucid moments, his voice carrying just enough strength to reach where I sat reading nearby. I pretended not to listen while continuing to turn pages in my book. "He's very respectful," Zara replied carefully. "We're managing the situation as well as anyone could expect." "Good," Uncle Mike nodded slowly. "Kai's got integrity. Not everyone would step up like this for family." He paused, looking directly at me. "Your parents raised you right, son." Meanwhile, my parents' financial recovery was proceeding exactly as planned. The $800,000 life insurance policy had been restructured to pay out to me as Uncle Mike's nephew-in-law, with clear documentation that the funds would be used to settle my parents' business debts. Dad had already negotiated payment plans with their major creditors, contingent on receiving the insurance proceeds within 90 days of Uncle Mike's death. "Everything's falling into place perfectly," Mom told me during one of her weekly check-ins, usually conducted in Uncle Mike's kitchen while Zara was upstairs helping him with his evening routine. "The lawyers have confirmed there won't be any probate complications, and we've found a buyer for the development property that's been sitting empty. Once Uncle Mike passes, we can start rebuilding immediately." The casual way she discussed Uncle Mike's death always made me uncomfortable, though I attributed it to her practical nature and the emotional exhaustion of watching a family member deteriorate. Looking back, I should have noticed how confident she seemed about the timeline, how prepared for every legal and financial contingency. My relationship with Skylar remained a constant source of pain during this period. She'd blocked my number after our breakup, but mutual friends kept me updated on her life, whether I wanted to hear it or not. 3 months after our separation, she was dating Marcus Webb, a corporate lawyer who worked at the same consulting firm. 6 months later, their relationship photos were appearing on social media with increasing frequency. The speed of her apparent recovery felt like another betrayal, though I knew I had no right to feel abandoned by someone I'd chosen to leave. "You miss her," Zara observed one evening after catching me staring at my phone with what must have been obvious longing. We were sitting in Uncle Mike's living room after he'd gone to bed, the kind of comfortable domestic scene that would have looked perfectly normal to any outside observer. "Every day," I admitted, "but I made my choice. Family comes first." Zara was quiet for a long moment, swirling wine in her glass. "Sometimes I wonder if people use family loyalty as an excuse to avoid making harder decisions about what they really want." The comment surprised me. In the months we'd been married, Zara had never offered personal opinions about our situation or questioned the arrangement that had brought us together. "What do you mean?" "Nothing specific," she said quickly. "Just that sometimes doing what's expected isn't the same as doing what's right." Strange incidents began accumulating around the 6-month mark. Small things that individually seemed insignificant but together formed a pattern I couldn't quite interpret. Uncle Mike's medical appointments occasionally conflicted with the schedules Zara had marked on the kitchen calendar. His prescription bottles were sometimes empty earlier than expected, though his pain levels seemed stable. Most puzzling, I began receiving bills for medical equipment and services that didn't match anything I'd seen in the house. "Insurance complications," Zara explained, when I asked about a $3,200 charge for oxygen equipment. "Sometimes they require pre-authorization for things we've already received. The billing department sorts it out eventually." More concerning were the phone calls. Zara would step outside to take calls that came at odd hours, speaking in low tones that made casual eavesdropping impossible. When I asked about these conversations, she explained they were updates for Uncle Mike's medical team or coordination calls with the hospice organization. "End-of-life care involves a lot of moving parts," she said. "Doctors, insurance companies, equipment suppliers. Everyone needs regular updates on his condition." The most significant change was in my own life. Innovate Tech Solutions had promoted me to Senior Systems Architect with a $15,000 raise, recognition for my work developing their new client management platform. The promotion came with additional responsibilities and longer hours, but also the satisfaction of meaningful career advancement during a period when everything else felt suspended in uncertainty. "I'm proud of you," Zara said when I shared the news over dinner. "You've managed to keep building your life even with everything else that's happening." "Thanks," I replied, surprised by how much her approval meant to me. "It feels good to have something going right." Uncle Mike's reaction to my promotion was oddly muted. "That's nice, son," he said when I told him, but his attention seemed focused elsewhere. On papers he was reviewing that he quickly shuffled away when I approached his desk. By the 8-month mark, Uncle Mike's condition had plateaued in a way that confused his medical team. His energy levels remained low and his appetite poor, but the rapid decline they'd predicted wasn't materializing. During a video consultation with his oncologist, Dr. Patricia Vance, I overheard her expressing surprise at his stability. Given the aggressive nature of his initial diagnosis, I would have expected more significant deterioration by now, Dr. Vance told Zara. His blood work shows consistent with his condition, but his functional capacity is better than projected. He's a fighter, Zara replied smoothly. Some patients respond better to palliative care than others. That conversation planted the first real seed of doubt in my mind. Not suspicion exactly, but a growing awareness that aspects of Uncle Mike's situation didn't align with my limited understanding of terminal cancer progression. When I tried to research pancreatic cancer online, the survival statistics and symptom progression described in medical websites didn't quite match what I was observing at home. My parents' increasing anxiety about the timeline became more noticeable as Uncle Mike's one-year mark approached. Their creditors were becoming less patient with payment deferrals, and the business opportunities they'd been counting on were starting to slip away due to their inability to provide financial commitments. "Has his doctor said anything about how much longer?" Dad asked during one of his visits, the question delivered with careful casualness that didn't hide his underlying desperation. "These things are unpredictable," I told him, repeating what Zara had explained to me. "The doctors can't give exact timelines, but privately." I was beginning to wonder if there were aspects of Uncle Mike's situation that I didn't fully understand. The medical bills, the phone calls, the surprising stability of his condition, Zara's occasionally evasive answers to direct questions. None of it pointed to anything specific, but together these details created an undercurrent of uncertainty that I couldn't shake. Looking back, I realized that doubt was the beginning of my education, in how thoroughly people you trust can deceive you, and how even the most carefully constructed lies eventually reveal themselves through the accumulation of small inconsistencies that don't quite add up to the truth. Uncle Mike died on a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 13 months after his initial diagnosis. I was at work reviewing code for a client security update when Zara called, her voice trembling with what sounded like genuine grief. "Kai, you need to come home immediately. Your uncle passed away about 20 minutes ago. It was very peaceful." I found her sitting beside Uncle Mike's bed, holding his hand and crying softly. He looked smaller in death, his face relaxed in a way I hadn't seen since before his diagnosis. The hospice nurse had already arrived and was quietly preparing the necessary paperwork, moving through her duties with the practiced efficiency of someone who dealt with death regularly. "He went in his sleep," Zara told me, accepting the tissue I offered her. "I checked on him at 8:30 and he was resting comfortably. When I brought his morning medications at 9, he was gone. The nurse said it's exactly how these situations usually happen." My parents arrived within the hour, my mother immediately embracing Zara while my father stood awkwardly by the doorway, his expression cycling between appropriate grief and barely concealed relief. The next few hours blurred together in a series of phone calls, paperwork, and arrangements that Zara seemed surprisingly prepared to handle. "I've worked with families through this process before," she explained when I commented on her organizational skills. "There are standard procedures that make things easier if you know what to expect." The funeral arrangements proceeded with remarkable efficiency. Uncle Mike had apparently left detailed instructions about his preferences, all documented in papers Zara produced from his desk drawer. He wanted a simple service at Morrison & Sons Funeral Home, followed by cremation. No viewing, no elaborate ceremony, just a gathering where friends and colleagues could share memories and pay their respects. He was very specific about the cremation, Zara told Richard Bennett, Uncle Mike's lawyer, during the meeting to review his final instructions. He said he didn't want people standing around staring at his body, making small talk about how peaceful he looked. The service drew nearly 200 people, a testament to Uncle Mike's extensive network in the Portland business community. Former colleagues from his investment banking days, neighbors from his upscale neighborhood, golf partners, and members of his wine club all gathered to remember a man they described as generous, sharp-witted, and fiercely loyal to family. During the reception, I overheard conversations that painted a picture of Uncle Mike I'd never fully appreciated. "Michael helped me restructure my retirement portfolio 3 years ago," said Eleanor Hartley, an elderly woman who introduced herself as his neighbor. "Saved me from losing everything in that market downturn. Never asked for anything in return. He funded the scholarship program at Lincoln High School," added Thomas Chen, who managed the local community foundation. "Anonymous donation, but word gets around. Put 12 kids through college over the past 5 years." These stories made Uncle Mike's death feel more real and more final than the quiet scene in his bedroom that morning. Here was evidence of a life fully lived, relationships carefully maintained, and a legacy of quiet generosity that extended far beyond our family. The insurance payout processed with remarkable speed. Within 6 business days of Uncle Mike's death, $800,000 appeared in my bank account, exactly as the policy documents had specified. The estate settlement moved equally quickly, with Uncle Mike's house, investment accounts, and personal property transferring to me as his designated heir with minimal legal complications. "This is exactly how these things should work," Richard Bennett told me during our final meeting. "Clear documentation, no disputed claims, beneficiaries in agreement about distribution. Most estate settlements drag on for months because families fight over everything. Your uncle planned well." My parents' financial recovery began immediately. Dad paid off their construction loans, settled outstanding debts with 3 major creditors, and transferred $200,000 into a business account to fund their next development project. Within 2 weeks of Uncle Mike's death, Sterling Development was operational again, with my parents already negotiating contracts for a mixed-use project in Beaverton that had been on hold for over a year. "I can't believe how much stress we've been carrying," Mom told me during a family dinner at their house the week after the funeral. "It's like we can finally breathe again. Uncle Mike would be so happy to know his legacy gave us a fresh start." Meanwhile, Zara began making subtle preparations for our eventual separation. She'd found a position with a private care agency in Seattle, work that would begin in 3 months and provide cover for our divorce. The story would be simple. Grief and geographical distance had made our marriage untenable, but we remained friends who respected each other's need to move forward. "I'll miss this place," Zara said one evening as we sat in Uncle Mike's study, now legally mine but still feeling like his domain. "It's been a strange year, but not an unhappy one." "You've been amazing through all of this," I told her, and meant it. "I know the situation wasn't fair to you, but you handled everything with such grace." Zara smiled, but something in her expression seemed distant. "Sometimes grace is just another word for doing what needs to be done." The first irregularity appeared 3 weeks after Uncle Mike's death, when I received a call from Pacific West Insurance requesting additional documentation for their final audit of his policy claim. "Standard procedure for claims over $500,000. Explained Jennifer Walsh, the claims investigator. "We need to verify a few details about Mr. Hartwell's medical treatment during his final months." The specific request puzzled me. They wanted copies of Uncle Mike's prescription records from the pharmacy, documentation that Zara said she'd provided to the hospice organization for their files. When I called Morrison Pharmacy to request the records, the pharmacist told me something that made my stomach drop. "We don't have prescription records for Michael Hartwell going back more than 4 months, said David Morrison, the store owner. "Before that, his medications were filled somewhere else. Do you know which pharmacy he was using previously?" Zara couldn't provide a clear answer when I asked her about the pharmacy change. "Insurance networks," she said vaguely. "Sometimes they require switching to preferred providers. I handled most of that coordination for him." More concerning was a bank statement I discovered while organizing Uncle Mike's financial records for the estate lawyer. The statement showed regular withdrawals of $2,500 every 2 weeks for the past 6 months, all cash withdrawals made at the same branch location downtown. When I asked Zara about these transactions, she seemed genuinely surprised. "I have no idea what those were for," she said, studying the statement. "He never mentioned needing that much cash for anything. Maybe he was handling some business transactions he didn't want to discuss." The insurance investigator's follow-up call came on a Friday afternoon while I was at work. "Mr. Sterling, we've completed our review of your uncle's medical records, and we have some questions that require clarification. Would it be possible to schedule a meeting early next week?" "Is there a problem with the claim?" I asked, though the payout had already been processed and distributed. "Not a problem exactly," Jennifer Walsh replied carefully. "But there are some inconsistencies in the documentation that we'd like to discuss with you and Mrs. Sterling together." That evening, I found Zara packing boxes in her bedroom, organizing her possessions for the move to Seattle that was still 2 months away. "The insurance company wants to meet with both of us next week," I told her. "They said there are inconsistencies in Uncle Mike's medical records." For just a moment, Zara's composure cracked. Her hands paused in their careful folding of clothes, and her expression shifted to something I couldn't quite interpret. Fear, maybe, or calculation. "What kind of inconsistencies?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "They didn't specify, but they seemed to think it was important enough to request a formal meeting." "I'm sure it's just bureaucratic thoroughness," Zara said, resuming her packing with deliberate calm. "Insurance companies have to verify everything for claims this size." But that night, I heard her on the phone again, speaking in the same low tones that had puzzled me throughout our marriage. This time, I positioned myself closer to her door, curious enough to risk the awkwardness of being caught eavesdropping. "We need to move up the timeline," I heard her say. "The insurance company is asking questions." There was a pause while she listened to whoever was on the other end of the call. "No, he doesn't suspect anything yet, But if they start digging deeper into the medical records, we're going to have problems. My blood turned cold as the implications of what I was hearing began to settle in. Medical record problems, timeline changes. Zara's mysterious phone calls throughout our marriage suddenly took on an entirely different context. I spent the weekend researching insurance fraud, medical documentation requirements, and the specific symptoms of pancreatic cancer. What I discovered made me realize how little I actually knew about Uncle Mike's condition, his treatment, or the medical professionals who had supposedly been managing his care. By Monday morning, I had a growing list of questions that I wasn't sure I wanted answered, and a sick certainty that the life insurance payout that had saved my parents' business might be built on something much more complicated than a family member's natural death. The meeting with Jennifer Walsh was scheduled for Wednesday at 2 p.m. As that appointment approached, I found myself studying Zara's behavior with new attention, looking for signs of the deception that I was beginning to suspect had been hiding in plain sight throughout our entire marriage. The insurance investigation meeting took place in a sterile conference room at Pacific West Insurance, where Jennifer Walsh laid out documents across a polished oak table like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. Zara sat beside me, her hands folded calmly in her lap, but I noticed a slight tremor in her left foot that she couldn't quite control. "Mr. and Mrs. Sterling," Jennifer began, opening a thick file folder, "we've completed our standard audit of your uncle's claim, and several discrepancies have emerged that require clarification." She spread out photocopied medical records, prescription logs, and what appeared to be billing statements from various healthcare providers. The primary issue involves Mr. Hartwell's oncologist, Dr. Patricia Vance. According to our records, she conducted video consultations with your family throughout his treatment. However, when we contacted Dr. Vance's office for confirmation, they have no record of Michael Hartwell ever being a patient. The room seemed to tilt slightly as I processed this information. "That's impossible," I said. "I heard Zara talking to Dr. Vance multiple times. They discussed his blood work, his medication adjustments, his prognosis." Jennifer Walsh nodded sympathetically. "We thought there might be a mix-up with patient records or billing systems, but Dr. Vance herself confirmed she's never treated anyone named Michael Hartwell. We also discovered that several of the prescription numbers on his medication bottles don't exist in any Oregon pharmacy database." Zara spoke for the first time since we'd sat down. "There must be some kind of administrative error. End-of-life care involves multiple providers, different insurance network. Records get confused." "That's certainly possible," Jennifer agreed, "which is why we've expanded our investigation to include the other medical professionals involved in his care. Unfortunately, we're finding similar problems across the board. The hospice organization listed in his files has no record of providing services to your address. The medical equipment company that supposedly delivered oxygen tanks and a hospital bed has no delivery records for your uncle." I felt like I was drowning in information that didn't make sense. But the equipment was there. I saw the oxygen tank, the adjustable bed, the wheelchair. Zara was giving him medications every day. "We're not questioning that medical equipment was present or that medications were administered," Jennifer clarified. "We're questioning the legitimacy of the medical supervision and the accuracy of the diagnosis that justified the insurance claim." After the meeting, Zara and I drove home in silence. The radio played soft jazz, a soundtrack that felt surreal against the growing certainty that everything I thought I knew about the past 13 months was built on lies. When we pulled into Uncle Mike's driveway, I turned off the engine but made no move to get out of the car. "I need you to tell me the truth," I said, staring straight ahead through the windshield. "All of it, right now." Zara was quiet for a long time, long enough that I began to wonder if she was going to respond at all. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Your uncle wasn't dying, Kai. At least not from cancer." The confession hung between us like smoke from a fire neither of us could put out. I turned to look at her, this woman I'd been married to for over a year, and realized I was seeing her clearly for the first time. Then what was all of this? The diagnosis? The medical equipment? The medications? "It was supposed to be temporary," Zara said, tears beginning to stream down her face. 6 months, maybe 8. Just long enough for your parents to get the insurance money and pay off their debts. Then Uncle Mike was going to have a miraculous recovery. Or we'd quietly admit the diagnosis was wrong. The scope of the deception was staggering. "So Uncle Mike was in on this? My parents knew he wasn't really sick." Zara nodded miserably. "Your parents were facing complete financial ruin. Not just bankruptcy, but potential criminal charges for some of the business deals that went bad. Uncle Mike wanted to help, but he didn't have enough liquid assets to cover everything they owed. The life insurance policy was the only way to generate that much cash quickly." "And you? What was your role in all of this?" "I was supposed to be the medical credibility," she admitted. "A real nurse, Someone who could manage the fake symptoms, coordinate with fake doctors, make everything look legitimate to outside observers. Your marriage to me was supposed to eliminate any questions about caregiver fraud or undue influence. I got out of the car and walked into the house, needing space to process what I'd just learned. In Uncle Mike's study, I began pulling out files, looking through documents with new eyes. The medical records that had seemed so thorough were filled with inconsistencies now that I knew what to look for. Lab results from facilities that didn't exist, prescription numbers that were obviously fabricated, billing statements from companies that had never provided any services. That evening, I called a private investigator named Nolan Cross, someone Richard Bennett had recommended for employment background checks. "I need you to verify some information about a medical situation," I told him. "I'm beginning to think I've been lied to about some very expensive medical treatment." Nolan's investigation moved quickly once he understood what to look for. Within 48 hours, he'd confirmed that virtually every aspect of Uncle Mike's medical care had been fabricated. The Dr. Patricia Vance, who'd conducted video consultations, was actually Zara's former nursing school roommate, Elena Vasquez, who'd dropped out of medical school but retained enough knowledge to sound credible during brief video call. "The medications were real," Nolan reported during our meeting at his downtown, "but they were mostly vitamins and mild sedatives designed to make your uncle appear sick without action. The medical equipment was rented from 3 different companies using fake insurance authorizations that your wife somehow managed to process. How is that even possible? Don't these companies verify insurance coverage?" Small equipment rental companies often have minimal verification processes, especially for short-term rentals paid in cash. Your wife was careful to spread the orders across multiple vendors and never request anything expensive enough to trigger detailed reviews. The most disturbing revelation came when Nolan traced the $2,500 cash withdrawals from Uncle Mike's bank account. Those payments were going to a company called Sunshine State Medical Services in Jacksonville, Florida. On paper, they provide consulting for end-of-life care trends. In reality, they specialize in helping people fake medical conditions for insurance purposes. I stared at the documentation Nolan had compiled, hundreds of pages of evidence that my family had orchestrated an elaborate insurance fraud scheme and used my marriage as a key component of their deception. What's the legal exposure here? What kind of trouble are we all in? That depends on how the insurance company decides to proceed, Nolan said grimly. Insurance fraud involving amounts over $100,000 is a federal felony. Your parents could face 5 to 10 years in prison. Your wife could face similar charges, plus additional counts for practicing medicine without proper supervision. And you. I didn't know, I said quickly. I had no idea any of this was fake. The problem is proving that. You were the beneficiary of the policy, you received the money, and you distributed it to pay your parents' debts. From a prosecutor's perspective, you were the linchpin that made the whole scheme work. That night, I confronted my parents at their house, bringing copies of everything Nolan had discovered. They were in their kitchen celebrating the successful bid on their Beaverton development project, champagne glasses still sitting on the counter when I arrived. "We need to talk," I said, spreading the investigation documents across their dining room table. "About Uncle Mike's fake cancer diagnosis and the $800,000 insurance fraud you involved me in." The denial lasted exactly 30 seconds before my father's shoulders sagged in defeat. "How did you find out?" The insurance company started asking questions. "It turns out fake medical records don't hold up under professional scrutiny." I gestured at the evidence laid out between us. "Did it ever occur to you that this might destroy my life? That I could go to prison for something I didn't even know was happening?" My mother's response was immediate and defensive. "We were protecting you. The less you knew, the safer you'd be if anyone ever investigated." "Safer?" The word came out louder than I intended. "I'm married to someone I barely know. I've lost the woman I actually love. And I'm now an accessory to federal insurance fraud. How exactly is that safer?" "Your uncle wanted to help," Dad said quietly. "He knew we were facing criminal charges for the Henderson Project debacle, money we'd borrowed against property we didn't actually own, environmental assessments we'd falsified. This wasn't just about bankruptcy, Kai. This was about staying out of prison. The Henderson Project was a development deal I'd heard mentioned, but never understood the details of. According to my parents' explanation, they'd accepted $400,000 in development funding for a property that had undisclosed environmental contamination. When the contamination was discovered, they'd used falsified assessments to secure additional funding rather than admit the project was unviable. So you committed insurance fraud to cover up development fraud, I said, trying to process the layers of deception. And you dragged me into it by making me the beneficiary of a fake life insurance claim. We thought it would work, Mom said, tears beginning to form. Uncle Mike researched it for months. Sunshine State Medical Services had helped dozens of families in similar situations. The fake diagnosis was supposed to be temporary, just until we could pay off the debts and start over. And then what? Uncle Mike was going to miraculously recover? He was going to move to Florida, Dad explained. Start over with a new identity. Live off his legitimate investments. The insurance money would have covered our debts, and Uncle Mike would have been free to live however he wanted without the pressure of constantly bailing us out. Looking at my parents across the table, I realized I was seeing them clearly for the first time in my adult life. Not the struggling but honest business people I'd always believed them to be, but desperate individuals who'd made increasingly serious compromises when faced with financial pressure. "Where is Uncle Mike now?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Florida," Mom admitted. "He left the day after the funeral. He's been living under the name David Harrison in a condo in Key West, waiting to see if the insurance investigation would uncover anything." I drove home that night with a cell phone number for my supposedly dead uncle and a decision to make about what to do with the truth I'd uncovered. The insurance company was expecting a follow-up meeting within the week. Nolan Cross had compiled enough evidence to expose the entire scheme, and somewhere in Florida, Uncle Mike was living a new life, funded by the chaos he'd left behind in Oregon. But as I pulled into the driveway of the house that was now legally mine, I realized that the most important decision wasn't about Uncle Mike or my parents or even the insurance investigation. It was about what kind of person I wanted to be when faced with the choice between family loyalty and personal integrity. Zara was waiting for me in the living room, her suitcases packed and sitting by the front door. "I'm leaving tonight," she said simply. "I've caused enough damage to your life." "Actually," I replied, pulling out my phone to dial Nolan Cross's number, "I think you're going to want to stay. We have some calls to make." The flight to Key West took 4 hours, giving me plenty of time to review the plan Nolan Cross and I had developed during 3 intense strategy sessions. Zara sat beside me, nervously checking her phone every few minutes while Detective Arya Mendez occupied the seat across the aisle, reviewing the recording equipment we'd used to document Uncle Mike's confession. "Remember, we need him to admit 3 specific things," Detective Mendez reminded us as our plane began its descent into Florida. "That he faked his cancer diagnosis, that he planned the insurance fraud scheme, and that he's currently living under a false identity. Without those admissions on record, the federal prosecutors won't have enough evidence to offer you immunity." The immunity deal had taken 2 weeks to negotiate. In exchange for my cooperation in exposing the fraud scheme and recovering the insurance money, federal prosecutors agreed not to charge me as an accessory. Zara received a similar deal, contingent on her testimony about the fake medical procedures and her cooperation in locating Uncle Mike. My parents' situation was more complicated, but their cooperation could reduce their potential sentences from 10 years to 3. We rented a car at the Key West airport and drove directly to 1247 Sunset Boulevard, the address Nolan had tracked through Uncle Mike's credit card activity. The house was a modest beachfront cottage painted in pale yellow with a wraparound porch and a small boat dock extending into the clear blue water behind it. Through the large front windows, I could see moving shadows that indicated someone was home. "Are you ready for this?" Zara asked as we sat in the rental car, watching the house where my supposedly dead uncle was living his new life. "I've been ready since the day I found out the truth," I replied, though my hands were trembling slightly as I checked the recording device concealed in my shirt pocket. Uncle Mike answered the door, wearing board shorts and a faded fishing t-shirt, his face deeply tanned and his hair bleached almost white by the Florida sun. For a moment, he looked exactly like what he was supposed to be, a dead man seeing a ghost. "Jesus Christ, Kai," he whispered, stepping back from the doorway. "What are you doing here?" "We need to talk, Uncle Mike. Or should I call you David Harrison now?" He looked past me to where Zara stood on the porch, then beyond her to the rental car where Detective Mendez waited with backup recording equipment. His expression shifted from shock to resignation as he realized this wasn't a social visit. "You figured it out," he said, stepping aside to let us enter the house. The interior was simply furnished but comfortable, with fishing gear stored in one corner and financial magazines stacked on a coffee table that faced sliding glass doors overlooking the ocean. Everything about the space suggested someone who intended to stay permanently, not someone hiding temporarily while a situation cooled down. "The insurance company started investigating," I told him, settling into a chair across from where he'd positioned himself on the couch. "Turns out fake medical records don't hold up under professional scrutiny." Uncle Mike poured himself a glass of whiskey despite the early hour. "How much do they know?" "Everything. The fake diagnosis, the non-existent doctors, the fabricated medical equipment records. They've traced the payments to Sunshine State Medical Services. They know you're alive and living under a false identity. And your parents also know everything. They're facing federal fraud charges unless they cooperate with the investigation. Uncle Mike was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the ocean through the sliding glass doors. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness I'd never heard from him before. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, Kai. The plan was simple. I fake a terminal diagnosis, collect the insurance money to pay off your parents' debts, then disappear for a few years while everything settled down. No one was supposed to get hurt. Except me, I pointed out. I lost the woman I love. I'm married to someone I barely know, and I've been living a lie for over a year. You were supposed to divorce Zara after 6 months, Uncle Mike said defensively. The marriage was always meant to be temporary, just long enough to establish legal cover for the inheritance transfer. Zara spoke for the first time since we'd entered the house. The timeline changed because your parents' financial situation was worse than you initially told us. They needed more time to restructure their business, so we extended the medical charade. How much worse? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer would be devastating. Uncle Mike finished his whiskey before responding. They weren't just facing bankruptcy, Kai. The Henderson project involved environmental fraud, falsified safety inspections, and misappropriation of investor funds. Without the insurance money to cover restitution, your father was looking at 15 years in federal prison. The scope of my parents' financial crimes was staggering. According to Uncle Mike's explanation, they'd accepted $800,000 in development funding for a property they knew had toxic contamination, then used falsified environmental assessments to secure additional funding when the project became unviable. When investors threatened to sue, they'd borrowed against properties they didn't actually own to cover partial refunds. So you decided insurance fraud was a better option than letting them face the consequences of their choices, I said. I decided family was more important than following rules that protect insurance companies, Uncle Mike corrected. Victor and Elena made mistakes, but they were trying to build something. The system failed them first. The system didn't force them to lie to investors or falsify environmental reports. Uncle Mike's expression hardened. You've always been naive about how business really works, Kai. Everyone cuts corners. Everyone bends rules when they have to. Your parents just got caught doing what everyone else does successfully. Detective Mendez had instructed me to let Uncle Mike talk as much as possible, to allow his justifications and explanations to create a complete record of the fraud scheme. But listening to him rationalize the deception that had destroyed my relationship with Skylar and compromised my entire future was becoming increasingly difficult. What about me? I asked. What about the fact that you used my marriage and my reputation to legitimize your fraud scheme? You benefited from it too, Uncle Mike said, gesturing around the comfortable cottage. You inherited my house, you helped your parents avoid prison, and you got $150,000 out of the deal once we paid Zara her fee. I never wanted your money. I wanted an honest relationship with my family. Honesty is a luxury for people who don't have real problems, Uncle Mike replied. Your parents were facing criminal prosecution. You think honesty would have solved that? The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, with Uncle Mike providing detailed explanations of how they'd orchestrated every aspect of the fraud. He described the months of research into insurance claim procedures, the careful selection of Zara based on her nursing credentials and financial desperation, and the elaborate planning required to make his fake death convincing to outside investigators. Sunshine State Medical Services provided most of the technical support, he explained. They created the fake medical records, coordinated the false doctor consultations, and helped establish my new identity here in Florida. For $200,000, they handled everything that required professional expertise. And if I hadn't discovered the truth, how long were you planning to stay dead? Uncle Mike shrugged. 5 years, maybe 10. Long enough for the statute of limitations to run out on any potential investigations. Then I could quietly resurface somewhere else, claim I'd been suffering from amnesia, or living off the grid. As the afternoon progressed, Uncle Mike seemed to relax, perhaps believing that my visit was an attempt to negotiate some kind of family reconciliation, rather than gather evidence for federal prosecutors. He showed me around the cottage, pointed out improvements he'd made to the property, and even suggested that I consider relocating to Florida, where the tech industry was growing rapidly. There are opportunities here you wouldn't find in Portland, he said as we stood on the dock behind his house, watching pelicans dive for fish in the crystal-clear water. Cost of living is lower, taxes are better, and there's no reason you couldn't start over completely. Start over as what? An accessory to insurance fraud? Start over as someone who helped his family when they needed it most, Uncle Mike corrected. That's all anyone needs to know. When it came time to leave, Uncle Mike walked us to our rental car with the casual confidence of someone who believed he'd successfully defended his choices. He shook my hand warmly and told me to give his regards to my parents. "Take care of yourself, Kai," he said. "And remember, family loyalty isn't about following rules. It's about being there when people you love need you most." 3 days later, federal agents arrested Uncle Mike at his Key West cottage while he was preparing to go fishing. The recording equipment had captured more than enough evidence to support fraud charges, and his detailed explanations of the scheme provided prosecutors with everything they needed for a comprehensive case. My parents received reduced sentences in exchange for their cooperation: 3 years for my father, 2 years for my mother, both to be served at minimum security facilities with eligibility for early release based on good behavior. Uncle Mike, as the primary architect of the fraud scheme, received 7 years in federal prison. Zara and I divorced quietly 6 months after Uncle Mike's arrest, a process that felt more like dissolving a business partnership than ending a marriage. She used her immunity deal to secure a position with a legitimate healthcare organization in Seattle, while I returned the insurance money to Pacific West and began rebuilding my life with a clean legal slate. The most difficult conversation was with Skylar. I found her at the same restaurant where I'd broken up with her 18 months earlier, this time to explain the truth about why I'd walked away from our relationship. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," I told her, as we sat across from each other at the same table where I'd left her engagement ring. "I just wanted you to know that leaving you was the biggest mistake I've ever made. And it was based on lies I didn't recognize at the time." Skylar listened to the entire story without interruption, her expressions cycling through disbelief, anger, and something that might have been sympathy. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "I'm glad you told me," she finally said. "It explains a lot about why you seemed so conflicted when you broke up with me. But Kai, even if your family had been telling you the truth, you still chose them over us. That says something about your priorities that I'm not sure has changed." She was right, and I told her so. The fraud scheme had been built on lies, but my willingness to sacrifice our relationship for family pressure had been a real choice that revealed something about my character I wasn't proud of. 6 months later, I sold Uncle Mike's house and used the proceeds to start a cybersecurity consulting firm specializing in fraud prevention. The irony wasn't lost on me that my experience as a victim of deception had given me valuable insights into how these schemes operate and how organizations can protect themselves. I never remarried, though I dated occasionally and maintained friendships with several women who appreciated my honesty about the complicated circumstances of my first marriage. Trust, I discovered, was something that had to be rebuilt slowly, both in terms of how others saw me and how I viewed potential relationships. My parents were released after serving 2 years each, and we maintained contact, though our relationship remained strained. They moved to Arizona after their release, started a small property management company, and seemed to have learned from their experience with high-stakes financial risk. The most important lesson from the entire experience was understanding the difference between family loyalty and family enablement. Real love sometimes means refusing to participate in destructive choices, even when that refusal causes temporary pain or conflict. If there's wisdom in my story, it's this. When someone asks you to compromise your integrity for family reasons, they're not asking for loyalty. They're asking you to become complicit in their poor choices. The people who truly love you will never put you in that position. Have you ever been asked to choose between family loyalty and personal integrity? Share your story in the comments below. And if this resonated with you, please like and subscribe to join our community of people who've learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior. Remember, real family doesn't ask you to lie, steal, or sacrifice your future for their mistakes. True loyalty means being honest enough to say no when the people you love are heading down a path that will hurt everyone involved. Thank you for listening, and until next time, choose integrity over convenience, even when it costs you everything you thought you wanted.